My name is Mark, and I'm going to take a break from my 1989 RX Z28 Camaro restoration project and show you how I changed the front struts on a 2005 Mercury Montego. There are a couple tools here that you don't need, but I use a torque wrench to tighten up the wheels, the air impact to loosen up the wheels, and to tighten up an axle nut that you may not need to take off. The floor jack you will need. I use the blanket to crawl under the car, and you'll need something like the milk crate to hold that disc caliper when you loosen it up. I borrowed the spring compressor and the 32mm impact socket from my local auto parts store. You may not need that 32mm socket. As a heads up, if you've ever changed a strut on a GM vehicle like this Camaro, the Ford is much different. The strut slides into the steering knuckle. If you want the punchline, there are a couple of tricks to this. You have to remove the tie rod end, remove the lower ball joint, and loosen the bolt that goes into the control arm bushing. I used an air impact to remove the lug nuts. You can use a breaker bar if an impact isn't available. You'll need a jack stand and a floor jack to raise the car up. You may not need to loosen the nut that holds that front axle up. I did. It seemed to make it a little easier, but I don't think it's necessary. The next thing I did was to drop that tie rod end down. The top of that tie rod end is machined, so a 10mm socket fits over it, and the nut is a 21mm in size. So I just loosened up the nut by holding that tie rod end so the center didn't spin until everything was loose, and then that tie rod end just dropped down. I didn't need any kind of a pitman or a puller to pull it off. The next thing to tackle is the lower ball joint. It has the same setup. You fit a 21mm wrench, open-ended wrench on it. I had to use a 10mm wrench on the top, and you turn it until the nut comes off. Without loosening up the bolt that goes through the bushing on the control arm, I was not able to push down on that A-frame far enough so that I could pull the strut out where it was attached to the steering knuckle. I used an 18mm socket on the end of a 1/2-inch drive ratchet and a rubber mallet to pound it loose. I did not remove the bolt, I left it threaded in. Stuck a large screwdriver through the hole in the control arm and then put my foot on it and pushed down, and then that lower ball joint just came right out. With a 15mm socket on the end of a 1/2-inch drive ratchet, I loosened the two bolts that hold the brake caliper onto the steering knuckle. Also held in by those two bolts is a steering stop that needs to go back on the vehicle only one way. The brake caliper can be removed, but it does need to be set on something or suspended using mechanics wire so stress isn't put on the brake line. And the ABS tube can be removed from its clips and just set aside so it isn't damaged. Now all that's left is to loosen up the strut itself so we can pull it out of the vehicle. I had to use both hands on a 1/2-inch ratchet with a 21mm socket attached to it to get that nut loosened up, and then there's an 18mm wrench that I used to hold the nut in place, and I could use both hands to get that nut off. And you can see here that once I get it loose enough, that steering knuckle drops down just a little bit. 14mm nut holds a stabilizer to the strut, and underneath the hood, 13mm nuts hold the strut onto the bottom of the car. That big nut, though, we want to leave until later, until we get that spring compressed. So now, with all of those bolts removed, we can twist and turn and pull the strut away from the steering knuckle. With the strut off the car, we need to compress the spring so that we can loosen that top nut and then separate the strut from the coilover spring. The overall idea is to attach the spring compressors across from each other on the spring and to alternate tightening the spring compressor so the spring compresses evenly. Some people use air tools to speed the process up. I found that it's a safer route to use a hand tool. An air tool causes vibration, and that vibration could loosen the spring compressor, or if the spring compressor would slide off when it's under pressure, there could be a serious injury because of that failure. I cranked on these spring compressors until I saw the top of the spring just barely separate away from the strut mount that's on the top of the assembly. And when I saw that, then I went ahead and loosened up that top nut. Unfortunately, I didn't notice until I had the assembly on the ground that the top stud was rusted pretty bad. I think if I would have soaked it down with liquid wrench the night before and then took a wire brush and cleaned the threads off, that I would have been okay. But as it was, that nut got stuck and I had to use a cutoff tool to cut the top of the stud off, and so I could get the strut mount off and the assembly apart. To get an idea of the condition of the strut off the car is to press down on the strut and to watch it come back up. In this case, it came up, but it was very slow in coming up. To contrast that to the new strut, which I didn't show, the strut, once it's pushed down, it started to come up, and it came up very quickly. The strut mount came in 3 pieces. The 2 plastic pieces need to be assembled. They need to be put into each other, and I used a rubber mallet here to do that. And there are some orientations that need to be considered. The first is the bottom of the strut itself. That strut plate has a recess in it where the end of the coil spring fits into, and it's very easy to see once you get those 2 pieces next to each other. And the same goes for the strut mount on the top. That bottom plastic piece that I put together has a recess in it, and the top of the coil spring needs to fit into that. So the trick here is to get all of the pieces lined up and oriented into each other. There's a little bit better shot of where the top of the spring mounts up to the strut mount. And just like with the ball joint on the tie rod end, the top of the strut is machined so that a 10 millimeter socket fits onto it. And then this was a 22 millimeter wrench, a little bit bigger than what came off, that I used to tighten the nut up that holds the whole assembly together. So here, it took me about another 5 minutes to separate the spring compressors. Again, we want to alternate the decompression so that spring decompresses evenly. The other thing that needs correct orientation is that the arrow on the strut mount needs to point to the outside of the vehicle. Here's the back of the strut. The box on the bottom is encompassing the slot that goes into the steering knuckle. The box on the top shows where the arrow is that we just saw in the previous slide. Now I have my right hand on the strut, and I'm holding it up so that the bolts go through the holes in the body, and with my left hand I reached around and hand tightened those 13 millimeter nuts. At this point, the steering knuckle and the strut can be mounted to each other, and the 21 millimeter nut can be inserted on the 18 millimeter headed bolt that holds the strut to the steering knuckle. This job to do over again, attempt it without loosening the axle nut. Notice that the ball joint didn't line back up with the steering knuckle, and so I took my knee and pressed it against the rotor, and I turned the rotor and I jockeyed around with the steering knuckle until I heard something on the transaxle go back together. I sprayed down the rotor and the pads with some brake cleaner before I put it back together to get the grease and the grime off. don't think that the order of the remaining tasks is important. I chose to tighten up the A-frame bushing bolt, and I used a 1/2-inch ratchet and an 18mm socket, and I also used that rubber mallet to try to get the torque approximately to where it was when I took the bolt off. I chose to put some Loctite on the nuts and the threads for the tie rod end and the lower ball joint, and so I used some brake cleaner to clean the threads off before I put it together. I don't know that it's necessary. It didn't come with Loctite from the factory, and we're just reversing what we did before using a 10mm socket and a 21mm wrench. It's the same for the lower ball joint. ABS hose slid right back into its holders, but I had to jack up the bottom of the A-frame, and so the stabilizer bolt would line up with a hole in the strut. The brake caliper bolts had Loctite on them from the factory, and in reassembling the brake stop, make sure that the bottom of that stop points toward the middle of the car. The bolt holes on the top strut mount are not square, and the strut can mount 180 degrees off, which will affect the caster and the camber. On my vehicle, the arrow on the strut mount was pointing to the outside of the vehicle, and so that's the way I reassembled it. The caster and the camber are not adjustable on this vehicle, but they can be affected if the strut is mounted 180 degrees off. After the strut change, I took it in for an alignment, and the toe-in was off, so I do recommend getting an alignment after this procedure. Since I have a torque wrench, I torque the front lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. If you don't have a torque wrench, I recommend getting the lug nuts torqued the next time that your car is serviced. If the lug nuts are not torqued to spec, the brake rotors can warp. Thank you very much for watching the video.